So welcome to the London Business School and to our fourth session in the series Gaining Ecosystem Advantage. Today's session focuses on this question: building ecosystems in payments. Can Mastercard deliver profit and purpose? We're going to be delving into questions such as, how does Mastercard, one of the world's earliest platform players, manage and evolve its ecosystem? How does it manage its partnerships when the landscape is changing so much? And how does it manage both internal and external ecosystems, which include big businesses all the way to startups? And with all the changes in Fintech, how does it compete with some of the new payment ecosystems, such as DLT, blockchain, and Web 3.0? Payments, Fintech, inclusion, big brands, it's all here in the next 44 minutes. What more could you ask for a Wednesday? So my name is David Lanceville, and I'm delighted to be here with my co-host, Professor Michael Iacobides. Hi, Michael.
Hello, good to be here.
You are, of course, the Sir Donald Gordon Professor of Entrepreneurship and Innovation at the London Business School, a world-renowned authority on ecosystems, publishing many cited papers, including, I think, one of the most, if not the most, read paper in the Strategic Management Journal on ecosystems. We'll share the link to that and all the other publications you have in HBR, Sloan Management Review, and so forth. You are a senior advisor to BCG and to his company Evolution Limited, the chief advisor on the digital economy for the Hellenic Competition Commission, and a visiting scholar at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, which is particularly relevant for this discussion today. Now, as you know, for those of us who joined us in the previous sessions, and we are inviting some wonderful guests from the world of business, consultancy, and academia to share their experiences, lessons, and research. And to that end, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Kelly Devine, the UK and Ireland president of Mastercard, responsible for everything in that sphere and more, no doubt, the strategy, the direction of the business, and the success and performance of that business. And you've also held previous senior management roles at American Express. And I'm really happy that we were both colleagues back in PwC. A few years ago.
Just a few years say ago. How many?
Yes. My own background is as a strategy consultant. I've been involved in ecosystems for the last 25 years or so, more than 15 in designing, structuring, and implementing them. And I've published in HBR and other places. And I'm, in a previous life, a former senior partner in Strategy and. So today is about stimuli, ideas, practices, experience. We want to debate, so please get stuck in. Put your comments, questions, keep them clean in the comments box, and Michael and I will delve into them as much as we can. So let's get going. So Kelly, Mastercard, big business. I'm sure many of us, if not all of us, have a card in our wallet, purse, pocket. I won't show mine. I was going to do that actually, but I thought I might be giving away data for the rest of the world. So we know about the brand, of course, but we probably don't quite understand how the network, how the ecosystem works before we delve into all these fascinating topics. So we know about merchants, banks, and customers, but just paint the picture of the ecosystem that you operate, and then we'll delve into some more of the detail.
Yeah, we'll do, because there is a lot of confusion, if you like, as to what exactly is Mastercard do. So if you think about it, when you go into a shop, I'll make this real life. You go into a shop, you tap your card, you pay with your card, and you leave the shop with your goods. And no money has changed hands in that moment. But what has happened is that the shop believes it will get the money. So there's some trust that's been sort of created in that process that's really critical. And what sits behind that, I suppose, is on your behalf, you have a bank who makes that work for you. We call them an issuer because they have issued you with a card. There's the same on the shop side. We call them an acquiring bank because they've acquired the transaction on behalf of the bank. And in essence, Mastercard is the glue in the middle that sits between that issuing bank and the acquiring bank. So thousands, tens of thousands of issuing banks globally, tens of thousands of acquiring banks globally, we join them up. And in essence, we allow data and funds to pass between those groups. So when you're doing that transaction, are you who you say you are? Do you have sufficient funds? How much money ultimately needs to change hands? Is the merchant a good merchant? Are you likely to receive your goods if it's online? That glue in the middle is the part that Mastercard play. And we manage other ecosystems, but the main ecosystem we manage, the card ecosystem, that's it. It's largely the issuing banks and the acquiring banks. And at one step removed, of course, the consumers and merchants that go with that ecosystem.
Very clear.
So this describes pretty much what was, the monopoly in terms of doing these wonderful connections. And there is a few organizations that did that with slightly different tactics. And, I remember we were teaching strategy cases of, the competition and the differences, Mastercard and Visa and the positioning of American Express. But it was a handful, and diners went by the wayside a long time ago, although it started early. This has started changing, and it started changing because now payment technology is much more dynamic. It's more dynamic partly because we have significant opportunities of connecting bits and pieces of information and brokering this trust role. It's also changed because regulators want to induce more competition. So as a result of all of that, we see new players that have grown spectacularly if you compare with the traditional intermediaries that have taken decades to build the strength that they have. You look at new names that are coming up, Square in one part of the business or Stripe in another part of the business. Can you give us a sense of how the world is changing and the nature of other ecosystems? What are they? Are they simply players that connect with you? Are there different ecosystems that provide a similar service by providing new ways of combining them? Can you give us a sense of what the competitive landscape is between businesses that are themselves platforms or ecosystems? How does that work out? Help us understand that a bit.
Yeah, it's a complicated world. You've sort of got layers of ecosystems on top of each other. I think our philosophy is very much to be an open network. So we have some rules of engagement. If you're going to be an issuing bank or an acquiring bank, for example, so if you're going to sit on our network, we have some rules. That's critical for the trust piece. So, as I said, someone has to know they're going to get their money. Someone has to understand that if a consumer, if you dispute that transaction and say, hang on a minute, my flight didn't take off because the government changed the rules on me at the last minute, I know I'm going to get my money back. So we have rules. But beyond that, it's an open network. So that means players can participate in relatively traditional roles. So I outlined the issue and acquiring role, quite traditional, the way that the network has worked for the past 30 or 40 years. But people can come in and use that same functionality, that same spirit to do very, very different things. So they might pass data along the network to look at someone's things like digital identity. The network could be used to do that. The network could be used to do a transaction. Buy now, pay later is a good one, where some of those transactions run on a card rail, some of them might run on other rails. The consumer doesn't necessarily know which rail that they're running on. So I'd say one of the spirits is an open network, and therefore you will see other people do all sorts of interesting things with it. And we don't seek, if you like, to control that. We allow the innovation to happen on the platform that we've created. In terms of the other ecosystems that compete, if you like, with ours, the shift to real-time payments or the creation of real-time payments capability in the UK quite a long time ago, but globally is taking off like wildfire, in essence means you've got a really viable alternative to card. So you can now make a real-time payment, open banking. All of these solutions are kind of starting to evolve, and absolutely you see completely different players sort of vying for success in that space.
You talked about multiple layers of ecosystems in what clearly is a very straightforward picture, he says with a hint of irony. How do you keep a handle on it? You have a portfolio, but how do you keep a handle on both the ones that you manage with all the rules that you referred to, the ones that you stimulate because they're in Mastercard's interests, and if you like, the platform that you want to create for others? How do you keep a grip of it, and how do you evolve it in terms of you as the leader of the business, one of the businesses within Mastercard?
Yeah, I mean, on many levels, I guess. On one level, there's a sort of rule enforcement piece, if you like. We have a franchise team whose job it is to say, you're participating. Do you comply with the rules? Are you doing something particularly risky? And therefore, we have to look at that in a different way. Lots of debate at the moment, for instance, about crypto transactions that happen across the network and what's an acceptable level of risk for consumers and so on participating in that system, and how do we manage that? How do we make sure we comply with whatever the regulator's telling us? So there's a sort of very brass tacks management of the ecosystem. That's critical because of the trust piece. We have to make sure we deliver on that. And then, as you say, you're going to have different levels of engagement depending on what it is that the company's trying to do with the system. We manage everyone from the traditional banks, Fintechs, people doing completely different business models. I mean, you mentioned blockchain, people using blockchain to do, proof of provenance of goods. So not necessarily even to do with a payment, digital identity, things that sort of move related to the payment, but moving away from the payment. The digital players, the likes of Apple and Google, who clearly connect into different parts of our ecosystem in different ways. Governments, NGOs, huge range of stakeholders. And I think that the challenge, I suppose, is how you clearly have to understand what that huge group, what those sort of different stakeholders need and want. You have to be able to adapt, react, add value to those different groups. So you need people within your organization who have a huge breadth of sort of expertise, but at the same time, you have to stand for something. You can't actually be 20 different things to those people. You have to be Mastercard, but you have to bring Mastercard in a way that makes sense to the different parties that you're operating with. And I think that's, as someone managing the business that I manage, and it's sort of the way that the lights to turn them back on again here. It's that I think is the challenge that's tough, is how do you adapt, but at the same time you have to stay core to something that you stand for.
So before we go into how you do it, which is a fascinating question that we will want to explore significantly more in greater depth, let me just ask you the final sort of big level strategy question. If you think about some of the changes that are going on, we have technological change with the possibility of authentication changing in different ways. Distributed ledger technology is also evolving, and real-time information. That's sort of one big group of things. The other thing that is changing is regulation. Either the regulatory attitudes to things, including the attitudes, and you mentioned also blockchain related stuff that people want to either invest in or transact with, but also the rules for engaging. I mean, the EU, for instance, has pushed for PSD2, the payment directive, which transformed the playing field. Now, from your vantage point, what do you see as the most important forces in shaping your world moving forward? Is it the competitive action of firms who say, hey, payments now should be part of what we do? Is it the creation or the emergence of new players? Or is it the regulation and the fact that regulators come in? It may be all of the above, but what do you track as a leader who has to figure out what's going on before we go to how do you manage the ecosystem in particular?
The obvious answer is all of those things. I think if I'm trying to pin myself down, I think over the past 5 years, the next 5 years, what the technology actually enables has fundamentally changed and will fundamentally change. Things like in the last 5 years, real-time payments that fundamentally enables things that 10 years ago would have just been a pipe dream. And I think the evolution of CBDCs, et cetera, is going to do the same thing in the next 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
With foundations of the next 5 years, I think it will take effect, if you like, in the 5 years beyond that. And so, yeah, absolutely. Of course, you then layer on what is it consumers actually want, or small businesses, or, of course you layer on who you're trying to serve and what they need. Of course, you layer on what direction the regulator is trying to take the market in and what they're trying to enable. Of course, you layer on what your competition are doing. But I think right now, the most exciting thing is that the very foundations on which the ecosystem is built are fundamentally shifting. If we were to sit here now trying to design a payment network that did that thing I explained in the middle of connecting, banks with shops banks, you wouldn't design the card network, you would design something different. So the grains of sand are shifting, and I think that's the most exciting part of the payments ecosystem at the moment.
Quick follow on, because that's something that is not really happening in Europe yet, but it has happened in Southeast Asia. If you look at players like Grab, they have used Grab is this company that managed to beat Uber in places like Singapore and then dominates Malaysia and so on and so forth. But what is fascinating with Grab and its Malaysian competitor Gojek, which is the other big Southeast Asian rival, is that they're now changing their core into a payments cum services bundle, a super app where the payments are absolutely integral to their offering. Do you think that that is a trend, or is this a blip? Do you think that the subsuming payments into this one-stop shop is going to be part of what we might see there? Or is it that the regulation is so different in Asia that Europe or the US will not really be facing that? And then we'll go back to how you manage the ecosystem.
I think you're right. We haven't seen outside of Asia that idea of the kind of super app that into which everything is pulled under. That just hasn't, I would say that hasn't taken off. Why that is, I don't know. Someone who's really interesting on this topic is worth looking out is Ashok Vaswani, who's the head of the retail bank at Barclays internationally, who talks about their mobile banking app. They have something like 15 million customers, and he talks about their mobile banking app, if you like, as an extraordinary way of being able to engage with his customers. He's got 15 million customers, and almost every day in the UK, which I find absolutely remarkable, people check in. Pretty typically, most people check into their banking app once a day. So that is an extraordinary engagement channel. And so I can understand why everyone is pivoting around, whether it's the bank app or the payment side of it, because it's something that's important to people. And of course, it's convenient fact. People don't necessarily think about it that much, but it's a huge engagement opportunity. And so whether it's banks trying to exploit that, whether it's someone who's paying their drivers and trying to think about how they expand that relationship, whether it's someone prepaying someone's salary, I think we will see people explore that. Whether the finance super app takes off in Europe, I'm not sure.
I want to delve further into the I'm going to stay at the strategic level, following Michael's lead as always, before we get into the how. You talked a number of times, Kelly, about what you stand for, and I'm interested in the, if you like, what I would call the strategic identity of Mastercard in a world of the newer players you've just both been talking about, and the traditional competitors, Visa, Amex. So, what do you stand for? And in the worlds of multiple layers of ecosystems, what are they, if you like, the capabilities you've got to really master in order to not just preserve what you have, but really evolve and innovate beyond that? So identity and capabilities, how would you describe it for Mastercard?
I think Mastercard has a few things that kind of unique about it, I would say. One is a willingness to disrupt ourselves. I joined Mastercard something like 6 years ago now, and one of the first things we did in the UK when I arrived was the move into the account-to-account business via the acquisition of Ocalink. And I know many businesses who would have said, we're doing quite nicely in card, thank you. We will try and defend our corner of the universe, if you like, rather than move into a new space which we don't understand what the model might be, we don't know what the economics might be, we don't know what our role in it might be. It could disrupt everything that we do today, but we have some sense that that's where the future's going, and we're willing to back ourselves to take that risk and build a successful business off the back of it. And I think that willingness to take risks, to innovate, and by the way, not just to do that ourselves, but to really do that in partnership with the people we work with, our partners and customers, I think is something that's really unique to Mastercard. So it's that's sort of one philosophical pillar, if you like. Mm-hmm. I think working in service of your partners, if you're an ecosystem, we create the platform on which, to some extent, we bring innovation so on ourselves, but to some extent what we do is create the platform on which others can innovate. If you look at the likes of Monzo or Revolut or so on, lots of their businesses start with a card because you can work on a Mastercard or a Visa platform. And relatively quickly take a product to market. I say relatively because I'm making it sound much more simple than it is. But I think if you're going to run a business like that, operating in service of your partners and making sure you have that mindset is really critical. And so I'd say that was a sort of second pillar. And then the third, and this was really started by our previous CEO. We've had a new CEO who stepped in at the beginning of this year, but our previous CEO had this idea of how you combine doing well by doing good. And
yes.
And I think it's easy to be relatively skeptical about corporate slogans like that. So if anyone is feeling that way in the audience, I relate to that initial reaction. But it is very genuinely embedded in the Mastercard philosophy. There is a belief that by raising all the boats, if you like, that is beneficial to Mastercard, and therefore it is a sustaining activity that Mastercard can invest in. because it ultimately contributes to our business, but at the same time contributes to society. And I think wedding those two things together, it's not a philanthropy side of your desk type activity. It is integral to your business model and to your business outcomes. I think it is also something that I think lots of businesses are thinking about it now, but I think with the CEO we had, we were ahead of the game a little bit in having that conversation internally and externally. So
you've answered the question. You can deliver profit and purpose, and we're not even halfway through. There you go. It's quite a big, the observation I make before I hand over to Michael, and we've got some great questions coming in, which we should go to too, is it's one thing to talk in that way that you just described, but for an organization that has grown up, in a big, successful, profitable organization, to pivot in the way you described of disrupting yourself and doing good for others, both in the ecosystem and society, that's a pretty big cultural shift, and very, very hard to do. So depending on time, we might want to delve into that in a moment in the sort of how, but Michael, I know you're eager.
Let me just before we jump into the questions, and there's a number of interesting things that have already come up in the chat. I was thinking about what you were saying a moment ago about the potential attraction of payment as something that, as you said, people really care about. And I remember it was now nearly a decade ago, I think it was probably 2012, sitting, waiting in one of these buses in Davos. I was speaking with Margot Georgiadis, who was then the president of the Americas in Google. She was the CFO. And I was like, well, okay, just tell me, and I think it's easier after a couple of bottles of wine, what is it that you focus on? How is it that you build your ideas of what you will focus on in terms of ecosystems? She was like, well, okay, the first thing that we do is the toothbrush test. I was like, what the heck is a toothbrush test? Well, I mean, whatever we do must be something which you do regularly and may affect your life, like brushing your teeth. And it needs to be part of your routine. It must affect individuals. And I think it's really interesting, because I would agree with you, and certainly, banks, telcos have done the same thing, have failed to capitalize on the fact that they are parts of individuals' everyday activity, but they're a bloody nuisance. I mean, when I first taught a course with Barclays, I remember that, part of the look at our world is, you're more likely to get a divorce than to close the bank that you opened when you were a student. And I think that gives some amount of entitlement. And I think that part of this dynamic that you're talking about creates significant options for customers. And the world that you have described is a world whereby you need to be much more responsive. And the cool thing about payments is that you're responsive in something that matters. And if you play it right, well, perhaps then you're going to have an upside. Now, in order to do that, you need to connect with others. And now I'm going to move from a little bit more into the how, because when you say that we're going to do stuff, partly you need to make some good strategic decisions and decide which areas you're going to be involved in and which not, and how you will respond to the business models. But then as you decide how you're going to do that, you probably want to think about engaging with people outside your own organization. And now we're going to the second part of ecosystems, not only the bundles of goods and services, but the groups of other participants that move outside your organization, where you are seeking for new ideas and, frankly, the capital to support them in some of your partners, so that you can collaboratively go to market. Now, when we think about that, when we think about Mastercard being more open for these partnerships, in an area that's so ill-defined, it's not that that you need to build a well-being ecosystem. Apple is trying to do that, for instance, and okay, we're going to decide how we engage. You are in a world that is moving very fast. How do you do that? How do you engage with other organizations, and how do you invite them into the fold in order to find ways of creating joint value?
I think to some extent it comes down to this idea of your approach, and we've always had the view that it's better to have people have the option of being part of the ecosystem and derive value from the ecosystem and hopefully contribute to the ecosystem, than it is better to have people on the outside sort of sitting and innovating by themselves. So I think that the first part of that is simply being open to it and being willing to have conversations with people without quite understanding where it's going to end and what some of the risks and opportunities associated with these conversations might be, but a sort of willingness to embrace them. I think that's one piece of the puzzle. I think the second piece is an understanding that you can't necessarily control what all of the outcomes will be. To your point, these things take a very, very long time. There are lots of things that we've done, we've designed, we've tried to bring to market that haven't worked. They've either got stuck at the stage where we've taken to partners, they get stuck at the stage where they ultimately go to the end users. So you know, an acceptance of failure and an acceptance of change of what you thought you were doing will ultimately evolve into something else, I think is kind of another piece of the puzzle. But I think there's also a sense of a big ambition. You know, Mastercard, and this has really been under perhaps our new CEO, has set this ambition for ourselves to be a multi-rail payments company, so to move away from being card. For those of you who've looked at our logo, we don't use the word Mastercard anymore. The card, where we do use it, is a small c. So there is this ambition to be something more than card, to be where, however the payment is being made, that we can be relevant and add value to that transaction. And I think if you have a macro goal in mind, albeit you don't necessarily have an understanding of all the levers that you're going to pull to get you there, I think you have a way of starting the conversation with those potential partners from outside of your organization. You have a framework in which to engage with them.
Sorry, I'll have to have a quick follow on. That's attitude. I get it. What about structure? I mean, speaking, you know, or working with large organizations, one of the things that they complain is you get the dedicated people who are driving the ecosystem part, and they're like, onboarding customers, my legal department, systems, and you know, they have all the right intent and it goes nowhere. How do you manage it?
We're not at all like that. We've I would say the last 10 years we have had to learn a lot, because we've had to onboard different sorts of customers, right? We had a world, those of you who know Mastercard will know that if you go back 15, 20 years, we were owned by banks. You know, we were owned by the traditional bank. So we understood perfectly how to operate with those sorts of players, and they understood how to operate with us. Last 10 years, that's completely changed. The nature of partners that we onboard, whether that is Fintechs or huge, you know, Apple's type, you know, diverse partners work differently, don't understand us, frankly, don't understand or care why we do things this way just because we always did. So it's been a huge learning curve for us. We've had a number of programs in place that have had to shake up vast swathes of our organization, everything from relationship management, operations, onboarding, the kind of value-added services that we provide, the level of complexity that people have to engage with us, every, you know, the financials, the legal. We've had to review all of that to make it easier for different kinds of organizations to work with us. But that work is never done. That's not like, oh, okay, we're now easy to work with, is it? It's a constant battle, if you like, to keep on chipping away at the complexity whilst retaining the nuance of the business.
And it's making sure your actions follow your words or intent, because I could give you, I can't because of confidentiality requirements, a list of organizations that talk a great game of ecosystems, and then they basically give you a rule book. And some of those rules around innovation are, I mean, just squash it initially. So there's something about, okay, how does it feel for the other party in engaging with a big organization? And again, your work's not done. But Fabienne and James have been incredibly patient with their questions. You can probably see them there. If you can say thank you for asking those, keep the questions coming, everyone. So Fabienne asks, well, you can read it probably, Kelly. What do you see to be a great key growth challenge of entrepreneurial, innovative fintech actors in your ecosystem? So that's one part of the ecosystem. And then James asks about the threat, disintermediation threat, which Michael alluded to earlier in Apple Pay, Google Pay, and so forth. So both sides of the spectrum. How would you what's your take on both of those, Kelly?
I mean, fintech growth, I guess. I mean, there's the much talk about, you know, what's the path to profit versus the path to scale. I don't know how much I have to add to that debate beyond what's vast swathes of material written on that one already. What I can see within that market, which I think is really interesting, is that going back not that far, we got digital banks who in essence were trying to replicate the services of many of the main banks, but do it in a different way, better, newer, more customer-oriented agile platforms, etc., etc. And there were a number of those, and they've been relatively successful, I would say, with clearly a path to run, but have made huge strides in the past few years. The new entrants we see these days are not doing that. It's almost like that space has been absorbed already. Right. What we see now is much more niche players coming into the ecosystem, looking at relatively small spaces. So, for example, that could be targeting different demographics. So we're seeing a huge growth in, for instance, Islamic finance startups, or with fintechs that are aimed, for instance, at LGBTQ and how you support, the particular needs potentially of a certain community. So we're seeing sort of niche plays on who you're serving. We're perhaps seeing niche plays on the product itself. So lots of growth, for instance, in the salary card space. So how do you support people in drawing down the salary that they have earned? Lots in the inclusion space. So how we start to serve people who have perhaps not been well served by the traditional banking system, or who it's difficult to serve through the traditional banking system. So I in the fintech space, beyond the stuff everyone talks about, which is how do you find profit in that space, I think the question that the newer fintechs have to ask is, where is the space that's left to play in? Just coming in to be another Monzo, I'm not sure is the answer. I think people have to find something new. There's plenty out there, but we are seeing really, really different models. In terms of the disintermediation question,
before you go on that, being cheeky as I am, just to sort of keep the energy up, how would you describe your relationship or positioning vis-a-vis Apple or Google as you ask that question? How would you?
I'd say we're strong partners. I think there's lots and lots that we do with them globally, and I think it comes back to that philosophy at the beginning of us. We're not deciding the answers for consumers. Consumers will decide products that make sense for them. Our job is to create the competition and the optionality that enables consumers to have those choices. And if we can do that in a way that we're part of that conversation, then that's obviously the optimal outcome. But I think the day that Mastercard tries to decide that we know what the answer is, and to start shutting players out from being part of that creative process, that's the day that I would start to worry about where we're headed. But so yeah, I would say it's a partnership approach. I don't think anything else can work.
I see Rami Faraz says that he's a big admirer of how you transformed into a technology company, and I think that one of the subtext of what we're listening to is that the requirements now, as a result of both technology and regulation that essentially free up different types of entrepreneurship, is that the skills that you need are vastly different. And I suspect that even the job descriptions that you guys have evolved significantly over time. But let me now move to his question, because he's asking how Mastercard competes in the Asian market, where super apps like WeChat and Alipay are important, and we already spoke about Grab and Gojek, as now everyone tries to combine payments and bring it into the fold. And again, I think that there may be differences in terms of what Apple and Google are concerned of doing in their reputation for their own standing with regulators in Europe. But what about Asia? Do you know, I know it's not your market, but what's your bird's eye view of what Mastercard is doing there?
Yeah, so not my area of expertise to caveat before we start, but the market has evolved completely differently. I guess QR codes is a good example of that. It's something that prior to COVID, where we're now used to QR codes, maybe QR codes have got a path in the UK that I didn't think they had. But historically, I would have said that's not going to happen here. But then you travel to many parts of Asia, and that's something that's absolutely ginormous. So I think there's an acceptance that the markets have evolved in a very, very different way. Mastercard often have a traditional role that we play is in cross-border payments, because whilst you might have local schemes, and you get this a little bit in Europe, but you get it a little bit more in Asia, where you perhaps have local schemes that play. Mastercard's traditional role has been in the cross-border payment. So if you're traveling from Asia to Europe, your spend would be perhaps on a Mastercard or a Visa network. I guess the challenge for us is to find regulatory support and engagement in some of those markets. It's not always easy to enter those markets and to find a strong role to play. And sometimes that's been in different ways. Some of the work that we've been doing in markets like Indonesia, for example, has been absolutely on traditional card rails, but we've also been doing work to run the account to account payments network there. So if you want to make a transfer money to your someone who you split dinner with, or you want to make a payment on a QR code that's backed by an account to account payment, that's running on a Mastercard network as well. So sometimes the way that we participate in these markets is not going to be via the traditional let's try and win a card business portfolio. It might be by doing something completely different.
And if I may, I wanted to point that out, because that belies another important issue, which is that big ecosystem players don't always need to orchestrate. Sometimes they need to partner. And we heard your answer, both in terms of Apple and Google and in terms of what you're doing in Indonesia, and also to say, whose else's ecosystem can we ally with? To give another example of an area that I know you guys are working with, our second interviewee was Ahmed Galal Ismail, the CEO of Majid Al Futtaim Properties, which is one of the biggest real estate owners in the Gulf, and also owner, of all these fancy malls down there. And their loyalty scheme is run by and in conjunction with Mastercard. So Mastercard supports that in ensuring that people who want to have digital access can engage with them. So I think that sometimes people have the sense that we always need to be driving them. What I find fascinating is that, we can see in the example of Mastercard, the participation as a partner, which I think underpins this importance of, being more open rather than being, ego driven in your ecosystem, as opposed to thinking that you need to manage everything. But we've got a couple of things in implementation. So David.
Yeah. Who said there wasn't a red thread between our guests in this series? Who said there wasn't? Kelly, I will come to the great questions as I'm going to talk and read at the same time. Who said men can't do that? I'm curious, you pioneered within your own business, if you like, societal issues, tackling societal issues like financial inclusion. You talked earlier about open banking and the need for trust, of course, in terms of sharing data. And you looked at also, I think you've launched a new access card with a third party, look at it here, HI55, on managing short-term debt between paydays. Now, of course, there'll be a commercial interest, but you are also tackling societal issues, and you did it. So a lot of what I've just described during the pandemic, where a lot of people were suffering in this country and many others. Tell us about your process of selecting those issues and the role that your organization ecosystems play in enabling it. Because there'll be some organizations who, frankly, talk a good game and then wait for others and then join in. You've pioneered in those spaces. What made you do that? And what were some of the challenges that you faced in, if you like, tackling those issues while still making sure that you pay your own bills, if you like?
Yeah. Of course, it starts with a belief that you want to make a difference and you want to be a responsible corporate citizen. That has to be a driving force. But I think beyond that, we believe that the way it can be most impactful and most sustainable is if you do it in the areas where your business expertise, your business capital, what you spend your time on can be leveraged. So I think what we've really tried to do is to find the things where we can bring something meaningful to the table. So hence we've been really focused on financial inclusion and digital inclusion, because we do have the expertise and the network of people that we can bring to bear on that topic. And I won't go into all the numbers now, but I think it's very easy to assume that in a country like the UK that we have a high level of financial inclusion, a high level of digital inclusion. Sort of what's the problem a little bit? Let's focus elsewhere. But the stats of more than 1 million people who don't have a bank account, more than 12 million people are not what you or I would probably call digitally included. They might have a phone, but their data might only last them 1 week of the month, and the rest of the month they don't have any data. So, and if you're digitally excluded, of course, in this day and age, you're fairly financially excluded as well. So real problems in which Mastercard and all of the partners that we work with have something very genuine to contribute that we can embed into our business. And at the same time, of course, the more people who are financially included, ultimately that is the benefit of Mastercard. But I think that's the good part. That's what creates the virtuous circle. That's what enables us to really invest seriously in those areas. So that's what I would say. If you want to set a meaningful corporate agenda on a sort of social topic, it has to be something where you have some right and relevance to play.
Absolutely. Now, in the final questions that I see, and in the final minutes that we have, I see two different categories. So I'll try to take one, leaving the other one for David. Some of them are about, future and where will the sector be, and the other is about implementation and where you want the organization to be. So let me take the questions like Just Arnes or Aaron's, who are asking, well, what are your views in terms of the alternative payment mechanisms, and whether we will see new possibilities and perhaps even new ecosystems arising, or whether we're going to see the Apples and the Stripes of this world becoming big monoliths, because perhaps there is a thin edge of the wedge. But one of the problems in tech revolution is that we have seen a reduction in competition. So is there a ferment in payment before we move into areas where we will see again consolidation? And do you think, again, there's this question of whether Google, Apple, or BNPL Fintechs are the biggest concern that you have? That's on the big picture, and I'll leave David the final word on the question on implementation.
Oh, that I need my crystal ball to answer that one. I think I think we will see ongoing innovation from new people. I don't think we're going to see a convergence around one or two huge players. I think that the direction things are going in is too distributed and it is too open. The regulators have a very, very clear agenda in that space, for example. And I think it's to create the platforms and ecosystems and different payment infrastructure on top of which genuine innovation can take place. I think you can see that if anyone's super interested in this topic, the PSR have announced their new strategy for the next 5 years, and that's exactly the vision that they lay out for the UK. So perhaps it's my optimistic nature, but I think that's the direction it's going to go on if I had to bet.
Perfect.
We've had more questions in the last 3 minutes than we can cover, but that's wonderful, everyone. I want to go back to a question actually from that Ankita asked right at the beginning, which is around the behavioral aspects of ecosystem. Michael's point about eco and egos. So another cheeky question to finish with, which would be, if you had to look at your ecosystem strategy, the implementation of it within your own purview over the next year, which behavior and mindset would you love to build, and which one would you love to leave behind as you plan the year ahead within Mastercard?
Build on is in service of your partners, right? That's what makes an ecosystem work. Ones we could get rid of. That sense of this is how things are done today, right? I'm not saying we're not chipping away at that one, but I think if you're trying to lead an ecosystem that's evolving, you have to let go of the things you think you knew.
And I think that's a very potent lesson. Kelly, it has been an absolute privilege and great fun speaking with you. Of course, we don't expect your crystal ball to be any less foggy than any other, but it certainly helps push our own thinking. And rest assured, the challenges are common, including all the big tech firms who may be speaking grand about how well organized they are in their own ecosystem. But when you work with them, you see that it's as much of a mess as anyone else. So the question is, how can we adjust and adapt our own approach given the changes that we see around us? I think that the world of payments is an absolutely fantastic area, and we're going to see a lot more innovation. And it's great having thoughtful people like you to help shed some light. So as far as I'm concerned, terrific discussion, and thank you very much.
Yeah,
thank you for having me.
Wonderful, Kelly. Thank you for your candor and clarity. Thank you.